Basic Formal Ontology Practitioner Certificate, which is part of the Foundation Series, National Center of Ontological Research Academy. So I'm John Beverly. I'll be instructor for this module. I'm co-director of National Center for Ontological Research, assistant professor at the University of Buffalo, and affiliate faculty at the Institute for AI and Data Science. And today, as I said, we'll be discussing basic formal ontology in Module 3. I've got a little A there because this is actually going to be part of a longer series of modules. We had to break this down because what we're going to be doing is discussing real details, the theoretical underpinnings of basic formal ontology. So by the end of this module, you will know quite a bit about not just the theoretical underpinnings, but the real philosophical and theoretical motivations for the choices made in the basic formal ontology architecture. So this is, again, the third out of 4 modules. The first one discussing the motivations for basic formal ontology, the second discussing the methodological convictions of basic formal ontology, really highlighting what I take to be why it has been so successful and why I think it will be successful in the future. Today, in this module, we'll be discussing again the choice points, the theoretical background, the details underwriting the basic formal ontology. It is, to remind you, top-level architecture. It's used by over 700 open source projects, and it leverages basic principles of logic to make explicit the implicit meanings buried within data. And you see here on your screen a little bit of a snip, or the hierarchy. Not that many entities, not a very large structure that we can walk through, but as you can see, it's quite deep philosophically, as you'll learn. So it is a very high level. This is probably the first thing that needs to be said about it. You're going to see classes or names of entities or whatnot right here represented that you're not going to encounter, or at least not notably encounter in your day-to-day life. Things like spatial regions and immaterial entities likely sound foreign to you. I'm sure you're much more familiar with livers or Coca-Cola or computers or something like that. But basic formal ontology, again, it's a top-level architecture, and it's designed to be very high level to create that basic logical layer across all sorts of entities, like our data that represents all sorts of entities like livers and food and computers. And so it should be no surprise that what connects all of those things in the world, those more domain-specific entities, is something like a common logical layer that is, a bit foreign to common sense. Not that it is not commonsensical. There's quite a bit about it that is commonsensical, but it's more or less focused on what is logical. So we will walk through this. Now, continuant, as you can see, entity is bifurcated into continuant and occurrent, and a continuant in basic formal ontology is something that exists in time. It is wholly present whenever it exists, and these sorts of things lack temporal parts. I am a continuant. The computer that you're watching this on is a continuant. Your cat, your Coke, your phone, they're the sorts of things that exist through time. Now, this contrasts with occurrence. As I said, basic formal ontology is bifurcated at this highest level between continuance and occurrence. And occurrence are the sorts of things that exist over time. They have temporal parts. There are things like processes and events. There are things like me speaking, the speaking process, or a speech, or this lecture, a gesticulation, or baking, like driving, these sorts of things that have gerunds attached to them, that ing in words in natural language. In English, these sorts of items pick out, or these sorts of terms pick out what we call occurrence often, like things that happen over time that have temporal parts. Now, among the most important logical relationships is one that I've been referencing here when I'm talking about parthood. And in basic formal ontology, parthood, sometimes called mereology, comes in 2 flavors. There is parthood around continuance and parthood around occurrence. So continuance have only continuant parts, and occurrence have only occurrent parts. And so when I said there's a bifurcation between continuance and occurrence, what I mean is, I mean that logically. They are disjoint in that there is no such thing in basic formal ontology that is both a continuant and an occurrent. There's nothing that exists both in time and over time. There's no one thing. They're split apart And we do this, as you can see, for reasons that help, or in the interest of disambiguating the way the way the logic of the world is structured. This is just to say, to reiterate, no continuant may have or be part of any occurrent, and no occurrent may have or be part of any continuant. This is not to say there are not relationships between them. There certainly are, but parthood is not a relationship that cuts across these classes. I do mean class in this sense. Now, these items, these rectangles that you see represent classes or class names. So continuance and occurrence, these are classes of instances, or at least that's what they're picking out. For example, the class of tables would fall under the class of object in basic formal ontology, and your dinner table would be an instance of the class table. So continuance, when I said that continuant class there is disjoint from that occurrent class there, I meant literally, again, here's the logic coming out. There is no instance, there's no specific thing in the world that is both a continuant and an occurrent. And all of these rectangles are reflecting basic logical structure of the world, in that there are classes referring to, or that represent perhaps numerous instances of things out there in the world. And these arrows that are relating these rectangles, this is what we call the is-a relationship, where you can read this as class A is a class B, just meaning that any instance of class A is an instance of class B. So if you were looking here on the right-hand side under the occurrent hierarchy, you'll see process with an arrow pointed to occurrent. That is a relationship between them, just meaning that anything that is a process, any instance that is a process, is also an instance of occurrent. And so putting that another way, it's a subclass relationship. So if you're looking from the top and working your way down, what you're getting is more and more specialized, more subclasses that fall under these higher level classes. So you go, for instance, from material entity down to object. A material entity is the parent class of object, and fiat object and object aggregate, these are subclasses of material entity. And this is exactly how we should read this sort of chart. All together here now, this is a distinction that's drawn in basic formal ontology, many ontologies outside of this space, between types and tokens. And so when I'm talking about classes in the previous slide, I'm talking about them classes in the sense of types, and I'm talking about instances, I'm talking about instances in the sense of tokens. Like, for example, presumably there are at least between you and me engaging in this conversation, or at least this dialogue over this module, there are at least two humans, that is to say, two tokens of humans or two instances of humans, but Homo sapien is just one thing, right? There's one thing that connects us, that is the type. Now, continuance and occurrence have this sort of same structure, as do the subclasses that fall under them, or the subtypes that fall under them. So types here, the continuance at the top, and then instances, the things that you will find falling under these classes or these types in the basic formal ontology hierarchy. Now, as I mentioned, there are relationships across hierarchies. It's not just that subclassing, subtyping relation or hierarchy that we were just looking at that encompasses all of basic formal ontology. One of the key features of BFO is that there are structures or ways to connect parts of hierarchies to other parts of hierarchies. And one way to do this is in terms of dependence. So some continuants depend for their existence on other continuants. And at the same time, other entities do not depend on any other entities for their existence. And the latter are categorized in basic formal ontology as independent continuants, in that they do not require anything to exist. They exist on their own. You and me might fall in that category. A vehicle, a tank, an airplane, they are independent continuants. They are the sorts of things that bear qualities, like specifically dependent continuants or generically dependent continuants, as we'll talk about in a moment. But they are not, and those qualities depend for their existence on things like you and me, but we do not depend for our existence on them. This will become quite a bit clear as we work through some more examples, specifically with specifically dependent continuants right here in the hierarchy. So these are continuants that are in every case such that they specifically depend on some independent continuant for their existence. That is to say, they cannot depend on anything else. If they depend on anything, they depend on one thing. One or whatever they depend on, they continue to depend on for the rest of their existence. For example, the mass of a tomato specifically depends on a given tomato, and the shape of your smile depends on your face. And these sorts of things cannot migrate across bearers. So the specific shape of your smile depends on you, and so cannot also specifically depend on me, or cannot move and be my smile as well. This is the sense in which amine specifically depend on. It is specific to the bearer. Now, a very important subclass of specifically dependent continuants is quality. And these are the sorts of things you might encounter more often in your day-to-day life, or at least they're perhaps are a bit more commonsensical to you. Things like redness of an apple. Qualities in herein, we say, independent continuants. So the redness, as you can see here on your screen, that arrow, you can read that as inherence. So the redness inheres in the apple, and inherence is a dependency relation. Like if the apple stopped existing, that specific redness would vanish, but the apple could continue to exist with different shades of redness that could not themselves migrate to other bearers and are so stuck with, as it were, that specific apple, but could be lost and that apple continue on. Again, that is the sort of contrast we're pointing to here. The independent continuant apple could persist and go on and live on without the existence of the specific quality, but the quality, insofar as it inheres in the apple, any specifically dependent continuant, that is, or any quality of this sort, if it exists in that apple, and if the apple stopped existing, it wouldn't exist. So in BFO, as I said, or to highlight this, that is, instances of quality are said to manifest in full whenever they manifest at all. So the redness of an apple is right there in your face. When an apple bears that quality, there's nothing more to the quality to look for. You're not missing anything. If you see the redness, the quality, or if an apple has that redness, it's right there for inspection, right there for investigation. Just like the shape of the smile on your face is there for the world to see, that bright and shining smile whenever it is there at all. And there's nothing more to the shape than what is presented right there in your face. So that said, the various qualities you have in mind may be instances of the same subclass of the class quality. For example, you and I both likely have instances of weight. That's just a quality of us for the sake of this example here, weight being a subclass of quality, and something that, you'll have a weight, I'll have a weight, we'll have specific instances of that. There could be certain specializations or subclasses of weight, such as 16 kilogram, 15 kilogram, 14 kilogram, just for simplicity here. And then, of course, we can have instances that have these weights. And I'm just here simplifying a bit, but these are supposed to be not exactly the bearers, but the instances of 16 kilogram, instances of 15 kilogram, or the instances falling under these as well. They just happen to be, colorful photos of myself and some friends. Now you see here the type and instance distinction, but it's important to note that certain instances of the quality may fall under different specializations of the subclasses of quality that you see before you. Weight is a good example. So the instance of the instance of weight that was under 16 kilograms that you can think of as me bearing at a certain time, that is to say it's specifically dependent on me, could later fall under the 15 kilogram subclass of weight. And similarly, that's Regina Hurley. She's a faculty member here at the University of Buffalo who works with me. You see there that this instance 14 kilogram shifting over to 16 kilogram, and that's fine. Again, certain instances of quality may fall under different specializations of the subclasses of quality. And the way we keep this straight is that we call the subclasses of quality that remain the same throughout determinables, and those specializations that can change determinants. And so while my weight, the fact that I have a weight, is a quality that does not change of me throughout the instances, or throughout that instance changing subtypes, that instance may nevertheless fall under different subclasses of weight. So the same instance could at one point be under 16 kilograms, at another point be under 15 kilograms. Those can change. Those we call determinants, and we allow for that determinant change even while throughout, no matter what my weight is or how that instance moves across this determinant scale, it nevertheless has a determinable weight. So the determinable stays the same throughout. Putting that another way, I can fluctuate in my weight, but I will always have a weight. Even with determinant change, however, at no point does an instance of quality migrate to a new bearer. Rather, in those sorts of cases, there are distinct instances. And so this example here where you see the two, there's a picture of me and then a colleague of mine, Cameron Moore. We're both under 15 kilogram as instances. These are just, you can read this as specifically dependent on two distinct bears. They are distinct instances, even though they fall under the same determinant and determinable. Now, traditionally, determinants exhibit some ordering relative to a given determinable, such that if P is a determinant of determinable Q, then P is more specific than Q. And you saw this with the 15 kilograms versus weight, right? Like determinable versus the determinant, right? So, and there's also a strict partial ordering of determination between P and Q. And so there is a, that is to say, there's like transitivity. There, it's in this sense that there's a partial ordering, there's transitivity, there's an asymmetry, and there it's irreflexive. And so this relationship between P and Q is one in which you might have transitivity if there are other, say, other qualities above Q. Nevertheless, there's no case in which like P is a determinant of itself, or in which if P is a determinant of Q, then Q is also a determinant of P. And so there's, again, a strict partial ordering of determination between P and Q whenever P being a determinant is a determinant of the determinable Q. So you see here now, reflecting on the relationship of determinants themselves and sort of ordering you might see across them, no two determinants, typically speaking, can causally exclude one another. So the 14 kilograms determinant doesn't exactly causally exclude the 15 kilograms determinant or the 16 kilogram determinant. Of course, this is not to say that an individual or an instance could have them both at the same time, at least on a standard way of interpreting this. What these mean, that's not what no two determinants causally excluding one another means. What it means is the fact that some instance is a determinant like 14 kilograms cannot itself or does not causally exclude in any sense, say, that instance being 16 kilograms in the future or changing or fluctuating. Putting this another way, this sort of flexibility across the determinant structure, and so these things, while ordered, they don't exclude one another. Lastly here, I'll just point out that any two determinants are in some way comparable. We saw some of that comparability when reflecting on 14, 15, and 16 kilograms. There is clearly an ordering, a numerical ordering. This is often the case when you're looking at determinants. There's some kind of ordering that you can impose on them. It's a clear one. It's usually obvious. Weight was an example of that. Now, caveat here, the proceeding is not official BFO. This is more on the philosophical side. Just want to give you some pro tips that I find useful when I'm thinking about the ways instances, or the way specifically dependent continuant instances by themselves fall under different quality types, while nevertheless having some qualities or having an upper level determinable quality remain the same through that sort of change. Now I'll pop over here now to realizable entities, which is another subclass of specifically dependent continuant. And I highlight this here because not all dependent entities, like quality, fully manifest when they exist. Again, recall qualities are fully manifested when they exist at all. Redness is right there in your face. Not everything is like that. For example, solubility of sodium chloride is not of that nature. So the realizable entities are where we put items that do not fully manifest in that way. So they are the attributes of some material bearer that only manifest under certain conditions, like, again, the solubility of salt. So sodium chloride can dissolve in unsaturated H2O if it comes into contact. This is true of sodium chloride whether it ever comes in contact with sodium with unsaturated water or not. It is still nevertheless true, but it's hard to say that you can just look at sodium chloride and see that, right? Put another way, though, that realizable entities, these are the sorts of like properties that underwrite what bearers like sodium chloride can do. And as a rule of thumb, I'm kind of highlighting this. So if you're looking at a portion of sodium chloride before you, and suppose I ask, does this portion exhibit a lattice structure? You kind of only need to look at the sodium chloride to find the answer. Like, does it exhibit a lattice structure? We'll look at it. Obviously, that's its shape, right? That's its structure. These are specifically dependent continuate qualities. They're right there, fully manifested. Now, suppose, however, I ask you, is this portion soluble in unsaturated H2O? You're not going to be able to just look at it and find the answer. You're not going to be able to see just by staring at this sodium chloride unless you have a lot of like education or something. Maybe you can opine and speculate or hypothesize, but it's not fully manifested. The solubility of sodium chloride is not fully on display, and in that sense it's a realizable entity. It's something the salt could do in certain circumstances, not fully manifested at all times it exists. Realizable entities, putting this one more way, are how BFO represents modality, or the way things could be. The way the world is often differs from how it could be, or could have been, or will be. For example, a yoga mat is black, and you can see this. Again, that's that qualitative aspect. It could support a sleeping cat without you seeing that, right? Like, you have to look somewhere else to answer the question, could this thing support a sleeping cat? It's not just manifested right there in front of you. It's still true to say that of the yoga mat. Now, an important subclass of realizable entities are what we call dispositions. And dispositions are, just like all realizable entities, they're attributes of some material bearer, and they only become manifest under certain conditions, but these are a special sort. They're realizable entities such that if they cease to exist, then their bearer is in some sense physically changed. And the realization occurs when and because a bearer is in a special physical circumstance, and this realization occurs because of the bearer's physical makeup. So salt is the paradigmatic example of this. If sodium chloride is soluble, if it loses that solubility for some reason, that something about the lattice structure of sodium chloride has to change. And that solubility, that realization of it occurs when its unsaturated water is in play, and it occurs because of the sodium chloride's physical makeup. Again, I'm just kind of walking through this definition here. This key characteristic here, that physical change part, is very important to keep in mind. Lots of things have dispositions. Lots of entities in the world can do things or manifest capabilities or manifest functions so almost entirely because of the way their physical structure is set up, like the sodium chloride lattice structure. Like, that's exactly why it's soluble, just like it, or namely because of the way it interacts, that lattice structure interacts with H2O molecules and the covalent bonds binding them together. So now, as you can see here, I come prepared, right? You have, in this case, sodium chloride is bearing, or portions of sodium chloride bearing dissolving dispositions, and the H2O molecules bearing electronegativity attraction dispositions that kind of pull the sodium chloride apart at a macroscopic scale. You can see this at the top with the dispositions in play, but you can also see this at a microscopic scale with the realizations of various electronegativity and electropositivity attraction dispositions of the molecules involved. It goes at levels of granularity all the way down. We see dispositions throughout. Now, important to highlight here too, we call this, because of this dependence on the physical structure of a bearer, we say these are realizable entities that are internally grounded into the bearer. So dispositions, again, are internally grounded into their bearer. That solubility is internally grounded on the sodium chloride. And this is not the case for all other for many other realizable entities like roles. Roles are attributes of material bearers that only become manifest under certain conditions, but they exist because there's some bearer that is in a special circumstance. It's like social, physical, or institutional circumstance that they do not have to be. And still, they're such that, though, if if this physical or this realizable entity feature of them ceases to exist, nothing about the physical makeup of the bearer has to change. Examples of this are things like being a professor or being a student. Like these are attributes of material bearers that manifest under certain conditions, like one of instruction or one of like test taking or one of anxiety. They exist because they're bearers, like a student, individual who's in a university is in a special circumstance, like special set of institutional circumstances. Like I am a professor when I'm at the University of Buffalo, engaged in institutional instruction or something, or academic instruction. That's a special circumstance. I don't technically have that role when I leave, right? Like I'm in a special circumstance and I get to do certain things. I have new powers when I'm in that environment. I can realize certain processes that I wouldn't be able to realize without that. Nevertheless, if I were fired today, or if I lost my job, or if I just no longer bore that professor role, nothing about me physically would change. I mean, I might be upset about it, but I'm not going to be physically changed. Certainly not the way that sodium chloride's lattice structure would be changed if it were to lose solubility. So some other examples here, like presidency is a role that's occupied by an individual, and it comes with all sorts of executive powers. It comes with all sorts of new abilities. Now, when somebody exits the role, they lose many of these, but nothing about them physically has changed, although this is a somewhat taxed example because clearly we've all been familiar with the fact that people occupying this position at least seem to age rapidly. It seems like quite a stressful job. Nevertheless, if they lose it, nothing physically about them has changed or will change just because they've lost that role. In this sense, we say that roles are externally grounded. So again, in contrast to dispositions which are internally grounded in the material structure of their bearers, roles are externally grounded. They are grounded not just in that structure of their bearers, but also that this kind of bearers, like they share that burden with social or physical or institutional circumstances. So the role cuts across, like the university provides an institutional context for students and professors. We bear roles in this context, and because of the kind of breadth or multiple the reliance on context, we say this realizable entity is externally grounded. It's not just in me as a professor, it's also part of the university. It requires the university to exist. Tying some of this together, I'll just introduce you here to Barry Smith. If you don't know who he is already, he was the inventor of basic formal ontology. This is a photo of him, and he is an instance of agent which falls within the hierarchy of BFO, which we're going to encounter coming up. But I'm bringing this up because he is a professor as well. He's a SUNY Distinguished Professor of Philosophy in the Julian Park Chair, and this is a role he bears as a professor. It's a realizable entity, and there's a relationship between them. So Barry Smith bears this SUNY professor role. Now, last here for this module, I do want to highlight functions, which are a special type of dispositions. And as before, they're attributes of some material entity that are manifest under certain conditions, and they're dispositions that exist in virtue of the bearer's physical makeup. And that makeup is something the bearer possesses because it came into being either through evolution, such as through natural biological entities, or intentional design, such as in the case of artifacts, in order to realize processes of a certain sort. I'm putting this one other way, when you have something that bears a function, the reason that thing exists is because, or in pursuit of the function. So if you have a knife, for instance, and artifacts like this were designed to cut. That is why they exist. They bear the function and were designed for that purpose. Like your circulatory system, in contrast, also has a function, like the function to pump blood, right? And now that was not created or crafted or engineered by anybody that I know, or any human as far as I understand. Nevertheless, it was something that emerged out of biological evolution or evolutionary pressures, and it exists because of that purpose. Like your circulatory system moves blood around your body with the heart pumping and whatnot, serving a function. Now, functions in this case because of the way they are, because they have that design element. They are purpose grounded. We say that they can be malfunctioning or poorly functioning, right? There's some standards, some normativity built into them. So in contrast, like a disposition to dissolve in water. I mean, of course, we could characterize that with a sort of purpose or sort of normativity or evaluate it against some standards, but there seems to be nothing about solubility that is like normatively laden. Contrast this with a knife. Like a knife cuts well or it doesn't. Depends on how it was made. Circulatory system pumps blood well or it doesn't, right? Like these are born out of, again, the fact that these are functions that are born by bearers that underwrite what these bearers can do, or various things they can do, and they do these according to standards that were either designed or came into being through evolutionary pressures for certain purposes, and in that sense they are purpose grounded. And with that, I'm going to close this module. As I said, we have quite a few other aspects of basic formal ontology to cover. This was module 3A, just the first part of this theory of BFO practitioner certificate module. And so I will pick up again with the rest of the hierarchy in a follow-up session called Basic Formal Ontology Practitioner Module 3B. And with that, I will see you soon.